The main character, Ilian Heinrich, comes to the guild, and immediately a young man asks her how she is doing and if she is doing well. Then she happily replies that she doesn't know for what reason, but it seems to her that today is an insanely good and pleasant day. But after hearing this, the man is horrified and asks why, if Ilian Heinrich thinks everything is fine. She wants to resign and suggests that perhaps he has offended her in some way. But she only awkwardly averted her gaze and explained that there was no special reason for it, because she had simply grown old and could not work as before, so she wanted to leave. But the man indignantly remarked that she had not aged at all. After all, 40 is the most energetic age, and asked what the real reason was. But she only with a smile on her face asked why the man was reacting so funny and why he was so excited. After which she wondered if it was to the head of the guild, sorry that they would not see each other again. The main character looked at him and thought that maybe he was worried. And then she thought that usually male mercenaries prepare for retirement when they turn 40. Because this profession is dangerous for life, and with age it becomes more and more difficult to work. Then she disgruntledly said that the life of a mercenary is insanely difficult even for young guys. And if she continues to stay like this, she will only be a burden for their mercenary guild. But then, with a smile on her face, she thanked the man for trying to stop her. He looked at her smiling face and wondered if she really had to leave now, but she nodded her head firmly, letting him know it was okay. Upon seeing this, the guild leader only waved his hand in displeasure and informed her that he didn't want to look at her anymore, and informed her that she could leave as long as he let her go. So the protagonist, walking down the crowded street, thought about the fact that she had warned once before that she would leave. But it seems that despite this, the head was still upset and thought that she should have gone and comforted him. But she realized that it made no sense, because she had already left, and so it would be foolish of her to return. And now is not the time to think about it. The main goal was to find something to do for the rest of her life, and while thinking about it, she came up with the idea of opening an inn. She thought about opening a cave, but realized that she was probably too old for that, but decided that she would have to think about it tomorrow, since she was very tired. When she came to her house already late in the evening, she immediately heard some strange noise and absolutely did not understand who could come at such a late time and asked who came. No one answered her, and she immediately felt that around some ominous aura, and began to count how many people in the room. But suddenly the door broke open, and out of it jumped a crazy number of people who attacked the main character to take her life or take her prisoner. But after they all turned and looked at the window and realized that the girl had managed to escape and resolutely went in pursuit. At this time, the protagonist was running somewhere on the street thinking that this way should lead to the square, but at this time there are probably not many people, so she cannot get lost. To her great regret, she was quickly spotted, and so the thugs who were breathing and backing up behind her ran after her and called all the other members of their gang to catch up with Ilian Henry as soon as possible. But she was running and thinking that it would be best to hide in the woods to get away. She ended up doing just that, and everything was fine till then, although she was still being chased. But she found herself at the edge of a river with an insanely strong current. She knew right away that if she jumped in, it would end badly for her. But she wasn't even given time to think about it as the thugs sneaked in behind her back immediately, who, grudgingly looking at Ilian Henry, reported that she was a very good runner despite the fact that she had retired. But her legs were really fast. The protagonist had absolutely no answer to this and wondered why the thugs were acting like this if they wanted to get her corpse in one piece, and warned her that they had better not make such a fuss. And wondered why they were following her, they only informed the girl that she was insanely daring for her position. One of the thugs who were watching her unhappily said that the girl should have been in the village 2 months ago. One of the thugs who had been watching her grudgingly said that the girl should have been in the village 2 months ago. She looked at him unhappily and admitted that she did remember being there, and that it was the same place where the villagers had united and bullied a girl. The disgruntled young man said that Ilian Henry was a mad Nakalka, because such behavior was just a tradition in their village. But such a thing could not stand the protagonist, who shouted at the man and asked, is it a tradition of their village to take a girl from a neighboring village and beat her to death for the sake of the victim, and asked if these people had any idea what she'd been through and what she'd experienced, and then said that she was only following orders from her father, who had given up his fortune just to save his daughter. But those absolutely did not listen to her, and smiling angrily, looking at the main character, reported that she dared to interfere with their tradition. So they were waiting for this moment when she would finally leave the mercenary guild. and now she was alone, so she herself could not cope with them all. But the main character was quite shocked to hear that she was lonely because she knew that she had always been alone. She never had a family to protect and a loved one, and she didn't even have any friends. And that's how she lived her whole life. Looking at the crowd in front of her, she realized that she would always be alone. So she looked at the people in front of her and then asked how much her life was worth. Ilian Henry was sure that her life was worth at least 10,000 gold pieces. And presumably if she died, these people would get their money. But the men who heard about it were only displeased and wondered how she knew all this. The protagonist, with a calm, cold-blooded expression, said that she had been a mercenary for a year, and if they were going to kill her, they would do it quietly. But despite her calmness, the men simply informed her that the girl had nowhere to run to anyway, so she had better surrender. She only smiled brightly and said that she didn't mind at all and was glad that at least before her death she was able to mock them. They immediately realized the main character was up to something, and the next moment she jumped resolutely into the water with a smile on her face as she thought about the fact that she was not at all sure she could live alone. But even so, she had no reason to die, nor did she have any reason to live. But suddenly the memory of Julius Aldehart came to her mind. The young boy who smiled so brightly, and Ilian Heinrich didn't understand why in the last moments of her life she remembered him. But then she realized that most likely when that boy would hear of her death, he would be madly sad. At this time, Julius Aldehart was being reported to by a servant who seemed insanely agitated, which the young man immediately noticed. This night for 15 years, every day he received a report about the heroine. He knew absolutely everything she did during the day and whether everything was all right with her health, and it was quite insignificant details. But Julius Aldehart still liked to listen to it. Then he looked sternly at the young man who had come with the report and told him that if he was not going to tell him anything, he would just go on about his business and asked him to hurry up. In fact, in such a gray and sad world of Julius Aldehart, telling him about Ilian Heinrich was the only joy. Then the knight bowed before him and told him the tragic news that Ilian Heinrich had died a tragic death. Looking at the knight before him, Julius hesitantly asked if the knight was sure of his report, but he was convinced, after which he inquired if the lord was all right. But when he raised his face, he was horrified to see that his majesty was trying to take his own life, so he cried out in terror and called for help. At the same time, in the pitch darkness, there were conversations among the servants who prayed that the lady would finally wake up, for help had already been given. The victim's name was Haven Winter, who was excitedly called by a knight trying to rouse her from her sleep. But the servant only scolded him and told him that he did not think that the girl was just waking up and had not even opened her eyes yet, so they should have waited. But eventually her eyes opened and the maid excitedly approached the lady. While the knight started to run away, the girl, excitedly looking at the lady, informed the knight that he should call the doctor as soon as possible, for which he had already run away, and excitedly informed that it seemed to him that the doctor had not yet traveled far. The main character raised her head at the maid and asked for water. But suddenly when she heard her voice, she realized that it was completely unfamiliar to her and wondered what had happened to her. She clearly remembered how she had fallen off a cliff and choked on water. When the main character was served the water, she was shocked. She didn't understand why the glass was so huge and just stared at the maid in front of her, wondering what was going on, while she asked Haven Winter if she was all right, and she seemed madly surprised at the treatment. So soon after the knight returned to her, Sir Dino and the maid began to ask the girl if she really did not remember who they were and everything that had happened. Sir Dino only looked worriedly at Tafia, the maid, and said that apparently Haven Winter was in a state of confusion, so she could not be pressured with such questions. But the girl seemed to be completely confused, so she turned to Sir Dino and asked how the young lady could have forgotten them. But the protagonist looked at the two excitedly and asked how old she was, and then Tafia explained that the girl had turned 12 this year and last year. She had been madly happy that she had finally graduated from the humanities class. Then the protagonist was excitedly looking over her glass in her hands and asked if she had really lost the creature when she fell out of the carriage, and she had not fallen into the water at all. But Haven was still looking at the glass in her hands, thinking only that my previously flabby skin had become young and firm. And then she began to remember everything that had happened to her, and she realized that she had jumped into the water heroically so that the men wouldn't get the money, and in the maelstrom, she had tried desperately to swim out to stay alive. But in the end, she had drowned. So the protagonist looked excitedly at the maid and asked what year it was. And she said with a smile on her face that it was the year 218 and the fourth month according to the Hareth calendar. When Haven Winter heard about it, she was madly happy that she was in the same empire where she grew up. But afterwards, she was surprised because the girl had just named 218 year, and the day of her resignation and death was in the 12th month of 228 year. And she was in the body of a 12 years old girl and came back 10 years ago. After realizing this, she immediately began to deny everything that had happened. But in the next moment, Haven Winter took control of herself and, looking carefully at the maid, asked her to reintroduce herself, and with a smile on her face, said that her name was Tafia, and pointing at the young man next to her, introduced him as Sir Dino. After listening carefully and remembering their names, the protagonist asked the guys to go out because she was a little tired after all that had happened. But at that moment, a worried maid asked if Haven Winter was all right, but she was surprised at her reaction and asked why she'd asked. Tafia calmly explained that the Haven Winter she knew was a shy child, so she couldn't even ask anyone to do anything or leave the room by herself, but then awkwardly apologized to the girl for her words, because she couldn't judge her mistress so easily. But Haven didn't seem to be offended by it, so she smiled at Tafia and then looked at Dino and told the girl that she didn't have to worry about it and to leave, and then explained that the two of them had been taking care of her while she slept, so they should go and rest. The young knight and the maid looked at each other uncertainly, not understanding whether they could go or not, but Dino gave Tafia an attentive look and said that if it was the order of the mistress, they should obey, but the girl obviously didn't want it and looked very restless. A red-haired woman who was looking at the protagonist said that if she was awake, she needed her to sign some papers and handed her a quill and told her where her signature was needed. But Haven Winter only looked at the woman in front of her and asked who she was. And the woman in turn asked unhappily whether Haven Winter had forgotten her own aunt, and did not understand what her father had taught her all this time if she had been brought up so disgustingly. But at that moment, Tafia intervened in their dialogue, and calmly looking at the miss informed her that she should wait, because Haven Winter didn't know many terms at her age and was also very tired. But at that moment, unexpectedly, the maid was struck by this woman and yelled at, wondering how such an insolent maid could interfere with her unsolicited advice. Then she immediately noticed Sir Dino, who was maddened by this behavior, and shouted at him, asking who he was and why he was pretending to be a noble knight, and asked if he was going to hit her, a woman who was an aristocrat. But he calmly bowed and apologized for his behavior. But at that moment, the protagonist took the paper that Rosaline Celian handed her and read what was written there in her voice. The paper said that the protagonist waived her right to all of Winter's property and ceded the right to the property to her guardian. Rosalind Sealjan only looked at the protagonist unhappily and asked Haven Winter why she was reading it in the voice, because all she had to do was sign it. But at that moment, the main character looked at Tafia excitedly and wondered if this woman was really her aunt. She convinced her that she had understood everything correctly. But at the next moment, unexpectedly, the protagonist tore up the letter and said that apparently at this time, people are more interested in money than in the health of their relatives. And she wondered if it was like this 10 years ago. Looking at this picture, Rosalina Sealjan was only displeased and asked what the protagonist was doing. But she said that the woman should have seen that she was tearing up the contract, and then she strongly threw it in the woman's face. Only mad and furious, she asked Haven Winter if she thought she would get away with such a thing. She was still her guardian, but the protagonist only looked away from the woman and told her that she was absolutely right, and she was her guardian for the time being, and ordered her to leave her room immediately. She was literally shocked by this behavior from a low girl. While Haven Winter turned to Dino and told him that he was supposed to be her knight, so she asked him to kick the woman out. He obeyed the order and did so while she was cursing angrily, not going to obey and screaming for Sir Dino to get his filthy hands off her, and she was ready to go out on her own. When the doors closed behind this person, she was immediately approached by Tafia, who asked if Haven Winter was okay or not, but she calmly looked at her and asked why she should feel worse. The maid calmly explained that this woman was her guardian. When she heard this, the protagonist thought about the fact that he was now in the body of a girl who was 12 years old and had lost her parents and now needed a legal guardian. But she was taken out of her thoughts by Tafia, who calmly looked at the main character and said that Rosalina Sealjan was a bit rude, but she was her only blood relative, and therefore Haven Winter should not communicate with her in such a way. Then the protagonist resolutely said that she agreed with such words, but even so, she was not obliged to hand over all her possessions to the guardian. Her guesses were confirmed by the maid. So Haven stated that she had to come up with some plan so that she would not need any guardian for the next 6 years. In the evening, still lying on her new bed, the protagonist thought about the fact that everything that happened to her seems absolutely incredible, but she really was able to go back 10 years ago and into the body of a 12-year-old unknown girl. In her mind, she still had memories of 40-year-old Ilian Heinrich, and she also still remembered all the memories of the mercenary guild Green Dawn, with whom she had risked her life together, and they had participated in a huge number of battles. And also she had a son, and then the protagonist excitedly jumped up from her seat and quickly went to the calendar and began to look at all the dates recorded there and analyzed what she had learned. After all, it was now 2018 according to the calendar of Giraffe, and comes out in 5 years in the second month of 223 years when the wind was blowing, and there was a snow blizzard. Her only child died. His life was cut short when he was only 5 years old. But then the protagonist, excitedly remembering it, realized that in her past life, she just had to forget about her son in order not to go mad with grief and continue to live on. But then she thought that maybe there was at least some chance to save him, and in that case, she could change the future. But for that, she had to find out everything about the owner of the body in which she had moved. The protagonist realized that this 12-year-old girl had a lot of problems. The first problem was that the Winter family was completely bankrupt. The main character, sitting in the study and leafing through all the papers, madly wondered where the huge debts came from. But Tafia calmly explained that the money was needed to pay the bills to support the estate. But the girl was only dissatisfied, asked if they do not have any savings at all, and what the maid calmly explained, that after the death of Baron Winter, business gradually fell into decline. So of the servants remained only she and Dino, who continued to serve her faithfully. At that moment, the protagonist thought about the fact that according to Tafia, there were only 2 servants left in this huge estate, and they both made that decision because they wanted to serve her family for the rest of their lives. Then the protagonist, decisively looking at the papers and writing out their debts, thought that with such huge debts, there is absolutely no hope for the future, and it seems that so far no one has thought about how to pay back all these debts. So she decisively said that they should sell the estate. Tafia was shocked to hear this and wondered what was the reason for the decision, as this was the last pride of the Winter family, which had been inherited for 18 years. But Haven calmly said that they had no other choice, because even if she paid off the debt with the money from her inheritance, she wouldn't be able to pay the bills every month. When Tafia heard about it, she literally cried without finding words to comment on it. Then she excitedly said that the Baron, her father, always said that this mansion should be preserved. The main character, looking at the face of the crying girl, said that she should not cry, and she was wrong. Then she said that she does not know how to comfort women, so she does not know how to help her. She ran up to her and held a handkerchief to her face to wipe away her tears and asked her to calm down, telling her that she would definitely think of something and would not talk about selling the house again. Then the protagonist got excited, looking at Tafia, said that it would be good if she tried to find out, and in the meantime, she would also try to find out some information. For that, she had to go somewhere. Then the protagonist, walking among the passers, I thought that at last she was able to get rid of the guardianship of Sir Dino. She also thought about the fact that even though she was a wandering mercenary, she had some savings before she died, because the guild gave her a fee to cover her daily expenses. She also received a small fee for her services. So it was finally of some use, because the girl in whose body she found herself had absolutely no money, and she was poorer than even ordinary citizens. And then she thought that it was insanely sad that a 12-year-old girl had fallen into such an exorbitant huge debt. At that time, she went to her grandmother's house and came in and asked if she was all right. But the woman was only displeased. She asked why Ilian Henrichus had been away so long and where she had been. But the protagonist calmly walked around the room and said that recently there had been a lot of orders in the neighboring town, so she had gone there. Then the grandmother was displeased. She asked why her granddaughter's voice had changed so much, as if she had become younger, because the woman was blind but immediately realized any changes. But the protagonist calmly convinced her that after that, the woman filling a cup of tea of the main character asked what had happened to her, stating that Ilian Henry never comes to her without a reason. But the girl calmly assured her that she had come to check whether she was alive or not. After that, she asked where the key she had left for her was now, because she had come for it and asked if her grandmother remembered it. But she looked at her granddaughter and wondered if she needed money again and said she could lend her some. To which Ilian Henry looked at her and wondered how her grandmother could have money and advised her to replace the old cups instead of giving her money, and wondered why she was still using such old dishes instead of the ones she bought earlier. At that moment, the woman immediately reached for the top shelf and said that, judging by the grumbling of the protagonist, it was definitely time for her to replace this cup, and then began to fumble for where was this key. Then she took it out of the box where it had been lying quietly and gave it to the girl. But she looked at it in surprise and wondered why the key was so badly corroded. Her grandmother said that Ilian Henry should be grateful that it had at least survived, for earlier she had intended to throw it away. But suddenly a woman leaned down over the protagonist and said that it seemed to her that the height and hands of the protagonist had become much smaller. But the woman laughed awkwardly and said that her grandmother seemed to have senile marasmus, because her hands could not have gotten smaller. But she said that she would like to touch her hands to make sure. But the protagonist excitedly went to the door and said that she had urgent business to attend to and that she had to go. Her grandmother said that Ilian Heinrich came here so suddenly and made her so worried, and said that she should not come so easily. But she laughed and asked why her grandmother was so cruel and promised that she would come again. Afterwards, the protagonist was sadly thinking that she couldn't admit to this grandmother that she was going to die in 3 years, and mentally thanked her for everything she had done for her. Then the protagonist came to the bank and turned to the lady working there. She was only madly surprised and wondered if the girl had lost her mother. But she calmly explained that she came to the bank on her own business. Hearing this, the young woman only said that in this case, the girl should come here with her mother. But she was not satisfied with this answer, so she looked at the employee and said that she was from Baron Winter's estate and her name was Haven. So she needed to check the safe, and she knows that if she has a key, she can check the safe without confirming her identity. The bank employee was surprised, which pleased the protagonist. After that, she was not satisfied and said that in their bank, they do not really look at the identity, but they do check the ID card. So she asked Haven if she knew that in the Empire, the ID card is issued to those who are over 15 years old. She handed the piece of paper to the employee along with the key and said that she knew that the girl would ask her about it. So she brought her ID card in the name of Baron Winter and then pointed to the fact that her name was written here and said with a smile that she was very busy, so the girl should show her the safe as soon as possible. She immediately got up from her seat and left, while the protagonist was thinking about the fact that she had succeeded and she had done the right thing by entrusting her money to a bank with such a weak security system. Then she thought about the fact that somewhere nearby it was possible to take a ride on a magic travel box. But suddenly someone called out to her. It was the same bank employee who looked at the girl excitedly and told her that to her great regret, her superiors had warned her that they could not show the vault to a child under 15. Haven was madly indignant and surprised at the employee who calmly explained that in the Empire, people under 15 must come to the bank with their guardian. In her mind, she immediately saw images of her horrible guardian aunt, who was literally a tyrant, and she immediately realized that this crazy woman would not even listen to her, and thought that maybe she should ask Tafia or Sir Dino. But unfortunately, she would not be able to explain to the young people how exactly she was connected to Ilian Henry's private vault. But the next moment, the excited girl ran to another customer and excitedly asked the gentleman why he had not warned in advance about his arrival and asked what he had come for. But he calmly said that he had come to check the safe Ilian Henry. The employee only excitedly said that earlier when he came last time, he had also talked about it and said that she had prepared everything necessary, and the rank of the vault can be selected in order. The girl was madly surprised to hear this, so she immediately looked back at the one who was interested in her vault, and it was Julius Aldehart, who was 15 years old at the moment. He looked carefully at the worker and said that he wanted to get out of the sapphire rank and asked if they could go through now. The worker said that they could go down to the vault now and check everything together. But suddenly to him excitedly turned Haven Winter, who asked the employee why she with a key cannot pass about some passerby without a key can do it. But she only displeased looking at the protagonist, said that she should express more cultured because this young gentleman and quite a famous man and was a duke. But the girl gave her key and said that she was not worried about it because she had the key to Ilian Henry's safe. Looking at the worried Haven, the employee calmly informed her that the young man was not going to check the safe at all, and that he only came every year to increase its rank. She only looked at the employee excitedly and wondered why Julius Aldehart needed to change her safe, and seemed really shocked by something like that. But suddenly, the boy touched her shoulder and, looking directly into her eyes, said that it was funny enough to hear that the young lady had the key. Looking at the young man in front of him, Haven Winter noted that the boy's eyes were, as usual, insanely dark, and there was some undisguised power lurking in them. Then, looking closely at his face, she stated that they had known each other for 16 years. But despite the fact that he and Ilian Heinrich had known each other for so long, the protagonist was quite nervous every time she looked at the Duke. But suddenly he spoke sharply and asked Haven Winter if this was the key to Ilian Heinrich's safe. Then suddenly to the protagonist approached his personal knight, who turned to Haven Winter, asked the girl to sell this key to the Lord, and offered her the sum of 5 gold pieces. Hearing this, she was quite surprised, but shook her head and said that she could not sell it. And the bank employee who was watching all this was madly surprised that for such a rusty key offered as much as 5 gold pieces. But suddenly, to her great shock, the young earl offered Haven Winter 1,000 gold pieces for her to sell him the key, and all the people around started whispering, not understanding that the young man now offered by something for 1,000 gold pieces. After all, it was an unheard of amount of money. And such an amount was enough to buy several buildings in the capital itself. But the protagonist just thought that basically 1,000 gold coins is a lot of money, and it was enough to make her give up the key, but she said she couldn't give it up so easily. At this moment, Julius, looking at the girl in front of him, said that in this case, he is ready to give as much as 2,000 gold, and all around people were literally shocked. But the main character was not impressed by this, so she, looking at his serious face, said that it is not about money. Julius did not react and offered her the sum of 3,000 gold for this key. Haven was madly indignant when she heard this and said that this was not the case at all, and the young man did not listen to her words at all and continued talking about his own things. But at that moment, the protagonist was approached by the knight Julius Aldehart, who informed the girl that she would have to go with them to talk. In the end, she ran after the disgruntled young man and asked him to stop and wait, while she herself was thinking unhappily about the fact that the guy had offered to talk to her earlier and didn't understand where he was going so fast. But at that moment, Haven was unexpectedly picked up by the knight, who apologized for his behavior and said that they could catch up with him much faster. They ended up in a cafe at a table with a beautifully arranged meal, and the young man, looking at the papers in front of him, asked the protagonist what payment she wanted, and Haven Winter was madly surprised at such a question. Then Julius Aldehart explained that Baron Winter's case had been closed after his death, and apparently Haven Winter wanted to repay the debt, or perhaps she needed the money to maintain that decrepit house. The protagonist, only excitedly looking at the young man in front of her, immediately realized that apparently he had time to analyze it all during the time they went to the cave. But her shock did not go unnoticed, so Julius Aldehart asked why she was acting so strangely and smiling at what she only awkwardly said that the guy looks like her acquaintance. Then she began to analyze that now Julius must be 15 years old, and she was about 30 years old at that time. And at 30 years old, she was working for Julius Aldehart, and it was very rare for a mercenary to look after a famous family. But in spite of that, Ilian Heinrich agreed because of the decent salary. Then there was another conversation between them, and Julius Aldehart asked if Ilian Heinrich wanted to quit her job and go to war again, and promised that he would increase her salary up to 10 million gold pieces. Ilian Heinrich was madly shocked by this at the time. She didn't know that Julius Aldehart was a duke, so sometimes she just called him Julius. But she didn't really like the job, so eventually she left. But despite this, Julius Aldehart did not leave his attempts and offered her as much as 30 million gold pieces. It happened exactly when Ilian Henry was going to leave for the war, and naturally she refused even such a sum. Then, returning from the memories, the protagonist calmly informed Julius Aldehart that, as she had previously clarified, that she did not need money at all. And then the young man asked, "Is she not going to the key?" But the girl only looked at the key that was lying in her hands and said that she was not going to sell it because it belonged to her. But she thought that if she sold it for 30 million gold, she could solve her financial problems, but she still could not give it away so easily. Seeing such a disturbed protagonist, Guy asked, is it really not going to agree to sell, and said that it would be the best option for her. But she, just looking at his cold-blooded face, and asked, is he now going to threaten her? On what the guy calmly explained that he is ready to go even at the threat of not going to give up the idea to get this key. And Haven Winter was unhappily thinking that Julius had been too quick to admit to threatening a 12-year-old girl, and that was absolutely his style. So she still scrutinized him. She asked him why he needed the key, but he only looked at Haven Winter unhappily and asked why he had to give his reason, to which the girl calmly replied that she wouldn't even think about whether she should lose the key if she didn't know the reason, and so it was in his interest that he should give it. The young man rising from his seat said that the only important reason for him was that the key belonged to Ilian Henry, but the protagonist calmly explained that this was not a good enough reason, because she also needed to get something out of the safe. But at that moment, a dagger was presented to her throat, and the young man grudgingly inquired did the girl know what was there. But she only a little fearfully reported that she knew very little. And the next moment, the young fellow inquired who she was to Ilian Henry. Haven only awkwardly looked away as she began to think of what to say, and the thought came into her head that she and Ilian Henry were friends, and even though they were 18 years apart, age wasn't that important to friends. Finally, hiding his sword, Julius apologized to Haven and said that having a friend who was 18 years younger than him was very similar to Ilian Heinrich. But she calmly accepted his apology and said that there was absolutely nothing wrong with it because he had not hurt her in any way. She confirmed his guesses and said that she had left it before leaving. Then she looked at the young man excitedly and asked if she could offer him some kind of deal. Then she said that the boy must be curious about what was inside the safe, and she was only 12 years old, so she could only check the safe if she was over 15. But he calmly assured the girl that he was ready to examine everything there, and assured her that everything would be fine. When the main character heard this, she jumped up from her seat and grabbed his hand, thanking him sincerely. But then looking at his serious face, she thought about the fact that in this safe, there was all sorts of trash and cigarette butts, and she was as embarrassed as possible. But the next moment, the young man wrenched his hand from her grasp, and she thought unhappily that Julius had always been so rude, but did not comment on it in her voice, and calmly informed the lad in front of her that she could not lend him what lay within. But he calmly convinced her that he only needed to look at the contents, and the protagonist was insanely happy about it and smiled, and said that they should leave as soon as possible. Eventually they did, and they got into the magical carriage with the worker. They went to the safe of Mrs. Ilian Heinrich, and the worker warned everyone that they should not move or the magic box would sink. And the knight, looking around, wondered why Ilian Heinrich had chosen such an old place for storage. But suddenly the protagonist calmly explained that at that moment Ilian Henry had no money to open an account, and the knight was madly surprised by such authenticity on the part of little Haven Winter, and so asked what she meant. At the same moment, the girl calmly said that it was just her guess, and she did not know the exact information. But Gaius was clumsy, so when he was getting out, he accidentally hit a bank employee. When Julius Aulahart saw all this, he grudgingly said that the knight could use some weight loss. But at the next moment, the doors opened and the worker with the bank said that they could go inside. As a result, the heroine found herself in front of one of the safes, and when she opened it, she immediately climbed inside to get the contents and asked all the other people to wait. Then she started excitedly digging inside the safe and looking for what she needed. Looking at this worker was surprised by what was happening and asked if she could help her. But the next moment, Haven Winter pulled a bow made of wood out of the safe. When Julius saw this, he said that Ilian Heinrich was a famous archer, and it seemed she had loved shooting since she was a child. But Haven calmly explained that he was right, and after grabbing the bags with money, asked the bank employee to help carry them. At this time, the young man was scrutinizing the contents, and even the knight noticed such attentiveness, so he asked what the gentleman was looking for. But the next moment, a gold pendant with a bright green stone was in his hand. After a little twisting it in his hand, Julius Aulahart pressed on the central stone, and from there appeared a picture of little Ilian Heinrich with her family. When the protagonist saw it, she immediately realized that it was her family picture, and she put it in the safe so that the picture would not be torn. So she excitedly ran to the young man, and holding out her hand to the picture, asked him to give her the medallion. But the man only looked at her unhappily and then raised his hand high in the air and said that he wanted to buy it. But Haven was madly displeased with this and said that it was impossible to estimate the value of this medallion because it was priceless. But Julius looked at the little girl unhappily and said that she had huge debts. And then he asked if she hoped to sell it only when the picture would be completely destroyed. but she only thought unhappily that no one sells the only family picture. But Julius calmly said that he would give it to her, but Haven was firm and said that she could not sell the medallion, for Ilian Henry had asked her to take it. Knight Gaius only thought that it seemed that his master wanted the picture for himself, for it was the first time he had ever seen Ilian Heinrich so small. But at that moment, Julius looked at Haven Winter and asked if the heroine was so sure that she would be able to keep the photograph safe and sound until Ilian Henry returned. But she looked at the disgruntled face and thought that even if Julius Aulahart gave her the medallion, he would still try to destroy it, because money talk was nonsense, because he was actually taking it away from her. Then the knight approached him and told him that Julius could trust him to keep the medallion safe until he returned to the manor, and promised that nothing would happen to him. But he calmly said that he did not need his help in this, after which he summoned the magical vault. Realizing her defeat, she looked at the cigarette that she had taken out of her safe and took it in her hands and thought that she had never realized that she would miss smoking. But at that moment, an excited bank employee ran up to her and indignantly asked the girl who taught her to do such a thing. And she only realized in shock that I myself did not notice how I took it in my hands to smoke, and acted completely out of habit. The bank employee continued to shout and said that the main character should call her parents as soon as possible in order to have an educational conversation. But Julius and his knight did not pay any attention to this, and therefore calmly informed Gaius that they could leave. In the end, calmly at home, the protagonist sat in her chair and calmly exhaled, and then began to reflect that the entire contents of the safe was only about 20,000 gold. And despite the fact that she had collected this money all her life, it was not enough. But in another place, it will be difficult to earn them. Then she looked at Tafia and asked her how long they could live on 20,000 gold, and she said that if they saved a lot, they could last at most 2 months, and with the best of luck, maybe a little more. And even if she and Sir Dino's wages were deferred, they would still have to pay for the upkeep of the house. She bowed to Haven and said that she was only 12 years old, so she and Sir Dino would take care of the finances. But the protagonist calmly told her that in that case, they should just start the business again. At first, Tana, not understanding, agreed with her words after literally shocked looked at her and asked if she just heard everything correctly, and she plans to take over the family business. Seeing her frightened face, Haven Winter explained that Baron Winter was her father's bonsai grower, and she wanted to continue his work. But she thought that although she had worked as a mercenary before, she had been madly in love with flowers since childhood, so it wouldn't be hard. But a worried maid told the protagonist that she would also need money for such a thing. Haven smiled and asked Tafia if she believed in her. Looking at the confident face of the little mistress, the girl thought for a moment and said that Haven was only 12 years old now and she didn't have to earn money, so she would try to work it out somehow. Haven only smiled and thought about the fact that her maid should not worry at all, because her parents died when she was 10 years old, and so in her past life, she worked literally everywhere. But suddenly, Sir Dino flowed excitedly into the room, and the protagonist madly wondered what was the reason for such an abrupt appearance. And then he did not hide his apprehension, said that she had received a letter from the estate Syrian. The protagonist was shocked, looking at the knight, asked if she understood correctly that her aunt had now decided to send her a letter. The letter said that if Haven Winter did not want to fail in her debut in high society, she should come to her aunt and kneel before her, and if she admitted her guilt, she would forgive and help her. After reading this, the protagonist was unhappy and put the piece of paper away from herself on the table, then told Tafia and Sir Dino that her aunt was an insanely annoying woman and wondered if she really needed to do that. The maid calmly explained to Haven that she would be 15 in 3 years and would be making her debut in high society. So if she didn't socialize, Baron Winter's family would go bankrupt and disappear. Haven had heard that her aunt must think that she would bow down to her when she turned 15 for the sake of it. Then she realized that the place she lives in is a house that is 18 years old and definitely worth paying off her debts with the help of her father's business. However, her aunt, who wants the house, is in no hurry to pay off her debts. But at that moment, the protagonist calmly stood up from her seat and said that this event is not soon, so she has time to think about everything, because if she starts worrying now, she will only have more problems. Hearing this, her syllables excitedly agreed with her opinion, not expecting such a thing from her little mistress. But Haven calmly explained that from today she must act more decisively, Seeing that she was going to leave, Sir Dino immediately went with her and asked her about the coup. She only smiled and said that she would earn money as she was now the head of the family, and it was already late today, so they should leave in the morning. As a result, the next day, as Haven said, she went with Dino to help the workers and tried to be helpful by helping carry the tree and cleaning, and by her actions, she caused a lot of anxiety to all the workers. But with a smile on her face, she assured them that everything was fine and joked with the men that they did not take her seriously. Looking at the whole picture, Sir Dino thought about the fact that Haven said she was going to earn money and went to the bonsai garden, although he thought there was nothing for a 12-year-old girl to do in such a place. Although some time ago the main character, when first came to this place, she spent an hour looking at the workers and caused a lot of questions about her behavior to go on. Absolutely did not understand why she came here. But then suddenly the man began to spin around looking for his scissors, and the protagonist immediately noticed it, so happily grabbed them and ran up and gave them to the man. As soon as he saw Haven Winter, he immediately realized that she was an aristocrat, so he asked who she was, and she calmly said with a smile on her face that a man could address her on the first name, and that position was of no consequence because age was more important. But the worker awkwardly looked at the girl and asked if he could really address her informally, and that only with a smile on her face assured him that everything is just so, and called him brother. He only laughed, not understanding such behavior of the girl, and so everything is still the same. That bright smile said that the young man looks very young. As a result, Dino returned from his reflections and watched his mistress thinking about the fact that Haven Winter all the time followed the garden workers and helped them in their work, and also called the men who look more than 30 older brothers, and so they all became friends. In the end, the protagonist again helped the man who was managing the tree, and he told her that he had a lot of work to do and that the little cat hands of the protagonist helped him a lot. But she only laughed and asked if she had cat hands and if Jarek's brother had dog legs. He only praised her and with a smile on his face told her that the girl should know that she was doing a great job, and she convinced him that she was. After that, she turned around and called her knight for help. But when he approached, she immediately turned around and walked away with a smile on her face, leaving a confused Sir Dino in incomprehension of what had happened. And happily running away, she informed her brother that she would put the branches a little further away and wondered if he was going to graft these branches to another tree. He praised Haven for her cleverness, but the girl only said with a smile on her face that the young man had better buy something tasty for dinner instead of praise. He laughed and promised to treat her to a drink in a cave, as it is now fashionable. But Haven only laughed and wondered, does he really want to pay for her help? As a result, the day flew by very quickly, and the young man standing in the middle of the workers said that everyone had done a good job, and recently they had had a lot of orders from high-ranking nobles, so they would have to work harder for a few days. The worker looked at the main character with a smile and said that soon they would have a lot of free time, but Haven Winter only wondered why he was so sure, because she was running after them all day today and helping them with everything. After hearing such answers, the worker asked if the girl was exactly 12 years old, because even his 30-year-old friend could not talk like that, but the girl only laughed awkwardly out of embarrassment. But suddenly, a young man who had earlier praised everyone for their work and told Haven Winter that he would like to treat her to a tasty drink at the cafe approached her, and her knight was just horrified, not realizing that his mistress had to work all day, and for this, she will only get some treat in the cave. But she did not let him speak and blocked the way with her hand, stopping him because she knew what would happen next. Suddenly, a man who had been having a nice conversation with her came to her defense. He went to the supervisor and said that Haven Winter had done a lot of things, so there was no way to repay the drink. He awkwardly acknowledged the worker's rightness and then asked if the girl wanted to come help them from tomorrow, because they had a lot of work to do lately, so if Haven Winter did a good job, he would pay her. But she said with a smile that she didn't mind at all, because she had already made friends with everyone. At that moment, the worker picked her up in his arms and twirled her around joyfully. Sir Dino was shocked, not knowing how to behave, because Haven Winter, despite being a child, was still his mistress, but she didn't seem to be embarrassed at all, because she was laughing with the worker. While he was praising the protagonist, he said that he would like his son to be like this girl, because his son can't even study properly. So if he had at least the same pleasant character, he could tolerate everything. But Haven Winter only smiled and said that the character must have been passed on from his father. Sir Dino was shocked, not knowing how to behave. Before Haven lost her memory, she was so timid that she couldn't even give orders to the servants. But now she had changed a lot. When all the workers began to disperse, Dinah turned to the lady and asked how she knew how to prune branches. She calmly explained that she had read about it several times in a book and also watched others while walking around the garden in the morning. The knight was obviously madly surprised by this because the girl knew a lot of terms and also knew the name of all garden tools. But she calmly explained that at first he only listened until he understood how to do it. Then Sir Dinah realized in shock that apparently at that moment when they had just stood in the garden for an hour watching it, it turned out that Haven Winter had been memorizing everything all along. And then he remembered that Jarek, the man Haven Winter had met and befriended in the garden, was the oldest and the easiest to make contact with. And so he had intervened when the head gardener had offered to buy the mistress a drink and sent her home without payment. So he looked admiringly at the girl that was happily walking in front of him and realized that she had thought of everything from the very beginning and seemed to be very delighted by something like that. Eventually, some more time passed, and the protagonist found herself at home, where I happily and a little excitedly met Tafia, who asked how everything went. But Haven Winter calmly explained that she had to take a bath and asked if the knight was going to go to the bath. Without waiting for an answer, she asked the maid to prepare dinner for them. She smiled happily and said that everything would be prepared as soon as possible. And the knight, still bewildered, watched this picture and did not understand how his mistress could now look like a father who came home after a day's work. He confessed to himself that he had thought that the lady would stop working in the garden after a few days, for she was young and the gardeners did not expect much from her. But it was not so, for Haven Winter had been working in the garden for a month. And of course, Sir Dinah was working with her. Then the main character happily ran up to the two workers, as she had already managed to get acquainted and become friends with them all. And at that moment, she was approached by a man who asked her what they would have for lunch. Haven only smilingly replied that the head gardener said that she would like something flour and most likely they will cook noodles. And the other man unhappily noted that this man always eats something like that. The main character happily said that then we'll go to the head gardener and ask him about bread because the men like sandwiches and she could make them. So the girl happily went to the head gardener and he greeted her and told her that she had come just in time because he wanted to give her something. And she came to the table and asked him if it was sandwiches because she had just come to him for them. But he handed her 2 envelopes and told her that he would take care of the sandwiches for lunch, and handed her a month's salary because she had done a great job. But the protagonist excitedly looked at the envelopes and said that most of the work was done by the gardeners, and she was just running around and helping out, and then asked why she had been handed a lawyer. At that moment, Haven smiled brightly and thanked him, saying that the knight would be very happy with that. Eventually, they went home happily, and the knight held his pay envelope in his hands and looked insanely happy and seemed really proud of himself. At this time, Haven Winter was thinking about the fact that she herself was able to earn 200 gold, and Dinah was able to earn 1,000. Then reflected that 1,000 gold should be enough for a month for one person, but they worked unofficially, so the head gardener paid them a pretty good amount. Then turned to Sir Dino and said that they had done well this month, so she offered to buy meat for Taffy to cook. He got excited and liked the idea. In the end, they went towards the market, and Sir Dino, pointing somewhere further away, said that earlier Teffia had told him that delicious meat could be bought in that alley, and the protagonist smiled happily and said that they would go there then. But suddenly the protagonist noticed a young man and went up to him and asked him what he was doing and if he had come to buy food for dinner. He agreed and told Haven Winter that he really wanted to buy apples. Then the protagonist pointed at the apple on the edge and said that these would be the most delicious, as the saleswoman always put the freshest away. It seems that the man was surprised, but the face of the saleswoman spoke for itself, and then he, fully trusting the words of the girl, held out and paid for the fruit. But then suddenly a young man approached the girl and thanked her for telling him where to get delicious apples and seemed very worried. But the protagonist only smiled calmly and said that it was a minimal amount of help, so there was nothing special about it, and wondered if he had called her for such a small thing. But then he explained that he actually had a small request for her. The protagonist listened to him attentively, and then the next morning she was on her way to town, followed by a worried Sir Dino, who told Haven Winter that this was unthinkable, and he can't let her act so recklessly because she can't work in an aristocrat's house. If Tafia finds out, she'll be devastated and disappointed. But at that moment when she heard about Tafia, the protagonist turned to him and asked him how much they had to pay this month's bill. And he calmly and a little sadly informed her that their bill was 8,000 gold. Then she reasonably asked him how much they'd earned last month, and he admitted that the two of them had earned 2,000 gold. 000 gold. And then she looked into his worried face and took him by the edge of his pant leg and told him that if this continues, they will simply go bankrupt, but pride, and they can save after they earn money. The knight admitted that he agrees with the opinion of the main character, but tried to explain to her that it is still not normal because she is of noble blood, and said that he himself will go to work, but she should not do it. Looking into the young man's worried and frightened face, Haven Winter realized that Sir Dino would continue to worry about the matter. The young man had never calmed down since yesterday when the young gardener had made his request to her. As it turned out yesterday, a young man asked the main character to replace him at work in the garden, and he worked at the Julius Aluharda estate. And that estate was an insanely hard place to get a job. After all, the name of the Lahart family is even on the national flag that is kept in the imperial palace. After all, the emperor, who was chosen by the Black Dragon, founded the empire, and then called this dragon Duke Lahart. It was impossible to check whether it was true or not since several hundred years had passed since then. But the Lickard family still exists today and has so much power that it can even change the laws. When she thought about it, Haven Winter realized that she could not keep up with such a great family. She was only the daughter of a baron. But if she worked at the Duke's estate, it would leave a shameful mark on her for a long time, so she could understand Sir Dino's fears. So looking at him carefully, she wondered if the young man could do the job for her. But the young man calmly explained that the gardener who had asked her to do it had not had high expectations. Haven agreed and asked him how long he thought they would be working in the garden. He said he didn't know and had no idea. Then the protagonist, remembering the garden in which they worked, calmly explained that there was enough work in the garden until June while the trees were blooming. And afterwards she asked Sir Dino what would happen in October when the leaves fall and what they would do if their work ended and there were no more orders. So it was obvious who would be fired first, her and Dino. He looked at the main character who was thinking so sensibly and realized that she was behaving differently from 12-year-old children. So at first he thought that the girl was just a little older than her age. Seeing how she perceived reality, Sir Dino realized that Haven Winter seemed more mature than even he himself, who was 22 at the time. She said firmly that they needed this job, so they had to go. Looking at Mrs. Sir Dino absolutely did not understand how a 12-year-old child, who should live her best life, could look so reliable because her parents died because of an accident after which the servants left the estate, as the future of the Winter family was doomed to collapse. And looking at the other servants, he and Tafia thought for a long time whether they should stay at the estate, barely 20 years old, but they couldn't leave. After all, it was the Baron who had helped his poor family in his time, and his wife once bought medicine for Tafia's sick mother, saving her life. So they decided to continue serving Haven Winter, but the future seemed bleak. But suddenly distracting him from his thoughts was the joyful voice of a smiling girl who asked why Sir Dino continues to stand still and asked him to stop being offended after all. She only scolded him a little, and he is already so upset. Looking at the 12-year-old girl, the knight realized that it would be just much more peaceful to support her and follow her. But suddenly they stopped at a building, and the knight asked excitedly why Haven Winter was not going straight to Duke Julius Aluhart's estate, but had decided to stop at a brewery. Then he informed her that she was only 12 and should not go to such places. Then the girl approached the owner of the brewery and said that she would like to see pink wine, but that it should not be too expensive and should be made by blending. Then took out one of the bottles and said that this wine is quite famous, but the protagonist is not satisfied looking at this bottle, said that this wine is too young, so she needed at least 5 years of aging. The man looked at her shocked, thinking she sounded like an adult, which was crazy weird. And at that moment, shocking him even more, Haven asked her to give her the Roblane that was next to the bottle he had wanted to sell him earlier. As a result, they left the brewery, and a worried Sir Dino asked when Haven Winter had learned to know about wine. But she calmly looked at the young man and told him that she had not learned it at all and had just run to the cellar in the basement of their house as a child. But then she realized with embarrassment that she had said something unnecessary. So she immediately told him that they were already close to Julius Aluhart's estate. So she ran ahead in order to get there as quickly as possible. But in the end, when they were near, the guards blocked their way and informed them that the Duke's estate was not a playground, so they should leave as soon as possible. The protagonist looked at them with a calm look and thought that they would surely regret it soon. Luckily, the man she had taken the things from came up and said he would be glad to help him. The guards were surprised and asked if the man knew the girl. He was about to say he was seeing her for the first time, but she said with a smile that they had come on an errand from Tyran's garden. Eventually, they entered the garden, and the man was clearly displeased, not understanding why they used a little girl to get into this manor that looked more like a castle. But the protagonist was not confused and noticed that here somehow suddenly there was wine, and because of the bottle may appear problems. So it is necessary to give everything to the butler. But he stopped her and took the bottle away and asked the protagonist where she had gotten it. But she calmly explained that one bottle would probably not be enough for him, and said she'd bought it from Tyran's garden, and they'd worked there before. He looked at the bottle of wine and wondered when this garden had begun to produce something like this. Then he began to think about the fact that May was the busiest month for gardeners. So if they had come to Fred, the only gardener on the Lickard estate, with this wine, it was likely that Tyrant had asked them to do the work in the Duke's garden. Seeing this reaction, the protagonist calmly turned around and said that she would probably have to report to the butler about the winery where the wine is made, and called a knight after her, saying that they have too much to do. In the end, Fred could not bear it and turned to the butler, who asked him in surprise whether the man really wanted to entrust the garden to the Tyrant gardeners, and then told him that Vincent's gardeners had done it every year before. Fred calmly explained that it was so, for it was his duty to be complacent. Watching all of this, the protagonist realized that the reason why the butler disliked them was obvious, because he did not inspire confidence in Fred with a bottle of wine in his hands and a little girl who wanted to work here. She ran up and hugged the butler and introduced herself. He didn't push the child away, and looking into her puppy dog eyes told her that he was pleased to meet her, but they still couldn't break off all relations with the gardeners for no good reason. But they're excitedly looking at him, she wondered if they really couldn't come up with anything. Looking at this picture, Sir Dino absolutely did not understand what is happening now, because after the accident, Haven became very friendly. But he first saw that she's so sucked up to someone. At this time, the main character mentally think about the fact that sucking up at 40 years old is a bit of a blow to her ego, but you need to be able to adapt. Then she remembered from her past that this butler had a great weakness for all things cute, especially children. And he started working for Julius Aldehart when he was still young and never married until his 60th birthday. So when he met the children of other servants, he was ready to give them everything. So the protagonist decided to gladly take advantage of this weakness of his. She followed her plan and sadly told the butler that her parents had died early and she had no one to rely on. But Dino had agreed to raise her, but they needed money. That's why they could barely get a job at Tyran's garden. If they couldn't get a job, they'd be thrown out on the street and left without a home, so they'd have to beg. When the butler saw such an unhappy protagonist, he immediately came over and hugged her and said that in that case, he would be very happy if she could work here. She was excited and asked if he was really willing to do it for her, but the butler smilingly said that he couldn't even imagine how hard it was for Haven Winter at such a young age. Especially since she had lost her parents, he was only too happy to help her. She was overjoyed and smiled brightly and thanked the butler for that, and said that she would come back tomorrow at the same time with the contract, and the butler waved goodbye. When the protagonist and Dino were walking home together, he excitedly asked the girl how she had found out about this method of conquest. She thought that apparently Sir Dino was wondering how she knew that Fred liked this wine and the butler liked children. But she realized that she could not tell him about it directly and informed him that it was just an accident, and she had bought the pink wine only because it was cheap. And butlers usually like little children because they remind them of their grandchildren, and then said that they should go home as soon as possible because she wanted to wash up and go to bed. Looking at the main character, Sir Dino thought that Haven Winter is really just a terrific girl. As a result, the next day the protagonist returned to the garden where the gardeners asked how Haven managed it all, because it is simply unthinkable as the aristocrats are very strict and they always choose the same gardeners and do not change them for anything. So they were interested in how the girl managed it. But she calmly reported that she just said that in the garden of Devera works very loyal and good people. Other gardeners marveled madly at the little child and didn't understand how their garden could be such a blessing. And other men reported that they could no longer imagine working without Haven normally. But suddenly, the man turned excitedly to the boss and asked him what he thought about officially hiring the girl as a member of their family, because she was doing a good job and helping with the tools, and she had also provided them with an order, so he thought she could be accepted into their family, even though she had only been working for a month. But the head gardener tried to inform that the young girl still did not know how to work for real. But the gardener was clearly not satisfied with this and said that they should teach her how to do it, as there were many skilled workers among them. The others also stood up for the little girl, saying that she had all the knowledge to do a good job, and if the girl went to others, it would be a real loss for them. Hearing all this, the head gardener realized that he just couldn't argue with his workers, so he awkwardly said that in that case, they couldn't do anything, and so he would officially hire Haven Winter. Then the protagonist ran to Julius' estate and immediately ran to the builder and hugged him, saying that she missed her grandfather very much. And he said with tears in his eyes that he also missed her madly and thought that before children were frightened by his wrinkled face, but now they called him grandfather, and it was true happiness. But after the protagonist excitedly pulled away and said that it was very rude of her to call everyone grandfather. But he excitedly tried to explain that Haven Winter can call him that as much as she wants, and he is only happy. And the protagonist thought that she has completely won the heart of the butler, and now he will be on her side. Then he looked angrily at the head gardener and asked why their contract is still not signed, and with a smile looking at the protagonist promised that before leaving he will be sure to prepare bread for her, so she should be sure not to forget to take it, and that with a happy smile thanked her grandfather for such care. As a result, all the gardeners were given a long reprimand by Fred, who told them that since they were at Lichert Manor, all the gardeners would work under his strict supervision, for the master paid special attention to the garden, so if anyone was disobedient, he would dismiss them at once. Then the worried knight said that the girl had been working with these people for a month, and that he was sad to see them being reprimanded. But she calmly explained that this is how it should be, and this is the kind of behavior that bosses should have. After all, some tension helps to work well, and if the gardeners make a mistake, the protagonist will be at a disadvantage. And now he was acting rather coldly, which seemed strange to him. But eventually, it was time for the rest of the workers to follow him to get to work. Watching all this, the protagonist reflects that the gardeners are a bit down now. But in a few days, they will all become friends. And as far as she remembers, Fred has only one drink with someone and becomes a friend for life. And then she remembered her past, for she had only worked at the manor for a month. But it was enough to memorize the names, ages, and even family connections of all the employees. And the person who first made her think she wasn't friendly enough was Julius Owledhart's personal knight, who was now standing right in front of her, and informed her that he and Haven had met again. When she saw the girl, he informed her that he had no idea that she would be working in Divert's garden. But she calmly informed her that she had only recently taken up the job. Looking at the man in front of her, Haven Winter reflected that she had always found it easy to socialize with those who were younger, yet she had always felt some sort of barrier in communicating with Gaius. And no wonder she felt that way because the man had disliked her so much before. But right now he was looking quite friendly. So he was looking at the little girl with a smile. But Haven Winter felt a little uncomfortable because they were connected by a long history.